Hello and welcome to Development, Conflict and Peacebuilding. I'm Giorgio Shani and I will be giving you a brief overview of theories of development and underdevelopment. Please note that this will be very brief indeed. I have uploaded readings on Moodle, which I would like you to read in greater depth. So this is just designed as a brief overview rather than a comprehensive survey of theories of development and underdevelopment. I should point out that this is a course of study and it is impossible to adequately summarize the different theories of development and underdevelopment in one lecture, but I will give a brief overview which will put you in a position to be able to answer the discussion question for next week, which is, which theory of development and underdevelopment do you find most convincing and why? Okay, let us start, let us begin. Now we'll begin by looking at various definitions of development. So if this was an interactive class like last year, I would ask you, what do you understand by development? And indeed, development has no one definition. However, a generally accepted definition is a definition which is provided by Chambers when he defined development as good change. Now, if we look at, or if we break down this definition, then we see that there is an objective and subjective element or dimension to development. So in order for development to happen, there must be change. There must be a transformation. This could be a transformation of the human environment, a transformation which impacts on human lives. It could take the form of industrialization or urbanization, transition to a technological era. However, change needs to occur. Now, the subjective element is provided by the idea of good. So it should be seen as a good change. Now, good is subjective. It cannot be adequately analyzed. I would argue that it cannot be quantified. Although, if you look at the work of organizations such as the United Nations Development Program, they do attempt to quantify through the Human Development Indicators, indices, which point to good change. However, the idea here is that good is subjective. So at the very end of the lecture, if there is time, I'd like to introduce you to the post-development approach. Post-development theorists say that all development is change, but it's not good change. So they would posit a different model than development. Now, I think it's worth pointing out before we proceed how the term development is translated into different cultural contexts. So all of you are enrolled at ICU, and ICU is a university in Japan. And when I first started teaching an introduction to development studies, when I first joined ICU 10 years ago, I was struck by the translation of development into Japanese. So there are two different words, at least two different words. I hope I don't make a mistake for translating development into Japanese. The first, kaihatsu, is how development is translated. So kaihatsu here means a notion of transformation, a notion of intentional construction. And this is what is generally understood by development within Japan. It's about doing things. It's about changing the natural environment. It's about improving people's lives. So there's a conscious, intentional element. It's similar to the idea of construction. However, the other idea of or the other way in which development can be translated into Japanese is haten. Now, if we look at haten, it's more of an imminent process. By imminent, I mean it's latent. It's something you can't see. So it's a change which is gradual, which takes place over a long period of time. And importantly, it's a change which impacts upon us human beings. So Kaihatsu and Haten are two ways of understanding development. My point of introducing them to you, particularly those of you who are Japanese or familiar with the Japanese cultural environment, is that the English term development encompasses both Kaihatsu and Haten. So the idea of conscious construction and also the idea of imminent gradual change. Now, perhaps the most readily understandable definition of development is economic development. Now, economics as a field of study, as a discipline, has as its focus the creation of wealth. So the main priority or the main purpose of economic development is wealth creation. We see this in the policies of many development organizations which prioritize economic development, particularly the World Bank, but also many national governments and state banks, which prioritize the creation of wealth. Not necessarily its distribution, but the creation of wealth. So development is tied in with wealth creation. The wealthier a society gets, as measured through an increase in productivity or gross domestic product per capita, then the more developed that society becomes. So this is the conventional understanding of development, or particularly economic development, which is development as wealth creation. This, however, can be contrasted with the notion of human development, which I'll be introducing to you very shortly. The notion of human development sees wealth creation as a means to an end. So for economists, wealth creation is an end in itself. The wealthier a society gets, the more developed it is. For human development theorists, many of whom were development economists, wealth is a means to an end. Wealth creation leads to development, but development is defined in terms of the expansion of choices. This is understood as freedom. And indeed, I have uploaded to Moodle the introduction and chapter 1 to Amartya Sen's classic book, Development as Freedom. So Sen, as I'll be introducing you to you later, was a development economist who was looking at famine. He is from India, and his path-breaking work was on famines, and he was working within a mainstream economic development perspective. However, for Sen, the creation of wealth only leads to development if it leads to an expansion of human choices. And in his work, he has indicated areas of the world which have managed to expand the areas of human choice without necessarily creating wealth, without transforming the economic capacities of their society. So development is still possible, even if you don't have the resources to do so. Okay, so we'll be focusing very much on the economic development and human development paradigm later in the lecture. However, the point I would like to make is all of these three definitions, development as good change, development as wealth creation, and development as freedom, come from a particular worldview. By worldview, I mean a particular theory, which was arguably the most important theory of the 20th century, which was the theory of modernization. Modernization meant that modernity, the transition to modernity, whatever modernity is, that's contested, was inevitable. And more importantly, it was desirable. Societies should become modern. Now we see this domestically in the transition of domestic economies from ones based on rural production, people living in villages, to people going to urban areas. This is a phenomenon of modernity. The transition, as we'll see later, from a society in which there are traditional modes of authority to one where there are impersonal modes of authority. So, for example, the idea of the rule of law, which is designed to provide stability in a society full of strangers. So modernization is seen as a paradigm which has, by paradigm here, I mean a theory which has shaped not only the study of academic disciplines, such as sociology, political science, and of course, development studies, but also which has shaped our lives. So most states themselves can be seen as products of modernity. Most states throughout the 20th century and up to the 21st century have been committed to modernizing, to transforming their societies. Sometimes this has been for the better, other times, as post-development theorists would argue, it has been for the worse. But there has been a commitment to modernization and to change. So the roots of development lie in modernization. Now, as we'll see later, modernization is not necessarily westernization. And I think this is where location is very important. So I'm delivering this summary in Japan, in Tokyo. Tokyo is still, I think, the largest city in the world in terms of population, and it is one of the most modern. It's certainly more modern than many, if not all, of the societies of the West. Now, Japan is not seen as a Western society. Technologically, it's modern. If you look at the eastern seaboard of China, then we'll see that China, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea are all in many senses economically and technologically more modern than Western societies, but they are not seen as Western. However, and this is something which post-development theorists also indicate, the West has monopolized the definition of development. So they monopolize the definition of development. What I mean to say is the criteria for being developed have been formulated by either Western states or Western-backed institutions or Western-trained economists. So we find, and I think this is particularly true if you look at relations between China and the United States or other parts of the West, an assumption that the values, let us say, of many non-Western developing or developed states are in a way not I'm struggling to think of the right word, but are not developed in a political or social sense. So, for example, built in to ideas of development is a belief which is very strong within the United States and within other Western societies, that development will lead to democratization eventually. So democratization here can be seen as a Western value. I'm not arguing that it's a Western value. In fact, Amartya Sen in Development is Freedom looks at the non-Western origins of democracy. However, this idea that development will lead to the creation of liberal democratic structures, would lead to a greater respect to human rights, can be seen as values which are promoted, particularly by Western institutions or by Western powers or by Western trained theorists. So the point I want to make here is that development as modernization is different from development as Westernization. So you can have societies which are non-Western, which are more modern than the West. But at the same time, because the criteria of development is monopolized by the West, we see that very often those same Western societies or Western trained economists would say that those societies are not developed socially or politically. They're only developed economically. Okay, so this completes, I think, our survey of the different definitions of development. Let me just go through them again. Our generic definition is development is good change. Development is wealth creation, which is the definition of development favored by most economists. Development is freedom, which comes from the human development perspective. Development is modernization, which cuts across all of the perspectives or all of the definitions of development. And finally, development is westernization. And I'm looking at development as westernization specifically because when we look at post-development theorists, they critique the whole notion of development as one based on Western values. Because they reject Western values, they reject the notion of development. Okay, let us look at greater detail at the distinction between economic and human development. Now, the first point to make is they're not mutually incompatible. By mutually incompatible, I mean there's no contradiction between them. They're not seen as two different approaches. In fact, economic and human development, economic development is seen by human development economists as a means to an end to achieving human development. So to use a very complicated word, ontologically, they have different ideas of development. By ontologically, I just mean that they have very different conceptions of development. So their understanding of what is development is different. Okay, let us look at the dominant model in economic development. So if we look at all the different approaches to economic development, there have been different paradigms of economic development, which we'll be briefly going through later in the lecture. Then we find that expanding income is seen as an end in itself. So the expansion of income, particularly, as we'll see later, once it is quantified in terms of gross domestic product per capita, this is seen as an end in itself. A wealthier society is a more developed society. Now, if we look at the dominant economic model, particularly since the 1990s, which is neoliberalism, which I'll be introducing to you later, there is an assumption that expansion of income is a necessary step for development, but the equalization of this income is something which is inevitable, something which will happen over the course of time. Therefore, the state does not have to intervene within the market. This is seen as trickle-down economics. Trickle-down economics is a form of neoclassical economics, which is based on the idea that we should let market forces decide the economy. So the wealthier a society gets, this growth eventually trickles down. The idea of trickling down means that it takes a long period of time. So let us take an example. I hope it's not too much of a controversial example. But if we take somebody like Bill Gates. So Bill Gates was, and I think still is, one of the richest men, or perhaps the richest man in the world. He also has a foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is dedicated to tackling polio, poverty, pandemics. Now, some people say, and this is his public perception, that Bill and Melinda Gates are exemplary human beings, are philanthropists and great citizens of the world who have helped billions of poor people. However, a more cynical approach using trickle-down economics would be to say, well, what else is he going to spend his money on? If he has, billions of dollars, there is only so many houses you can get. There is only so many airplanes or private airplanes you can buy. Eventually, that money will trickle down into the economy. And even if you, construct a whole range of houses or buy buildings such as, President Trump, this creates jobs for construction workers. So it stimulates the economy. So the idea is that growth trickles down. Now, if you look at places such as China and also India, which have recorded some of the highest economic growth rates in human history over the past 2 decades, we find that wealth has expanded. These economies are much bigger than they were before. However, particularly in a society such as China, which was characterized by more equal economic and social relations under socialism, we find that China has become more of an unequal society. China has now more billionaires than any society in the world, apart from perhaps the United States. India, which was never really an equal society, despite the commitment, the lip service, one would say, paid to socialist ideas. It was not an equal society due to the strength of the state, and also as a result of gender and caste inequalities. We have also found that the economy, which has grown between 6 to 8% since 1992, has expanded exponentially. But Indian society has also become even more unequal than it is before. But the idea here is that wealth trickles down, that the creation of more wealth leads to the creation of more jobs, more demand, and that eventually incomes equalize. Eventually, everybody benefits. Now, this is very different from the human development perspective, ontologically, in terms of the conception of development, of what is development. So if we look at economic development, expanding income is an end in itself. Whereas for human development, as I previously mentioned, income is a means to an end. Enhancing people's capabilities, the end. So the notion of capabilities, which is a philosophical theory, looks at what you are able to do. So being capable is, in a way, different from being able. In English, when we say that somebody has a natural ability, this is seen as something which somebody is born with. They have an ability, let's say if somebody is good at mathematics. The idea is you have a natural ability at mathematics. However, and this is where the notion of capability is important, if you don't have access to school, if you can't learn about mathematics in school, then there's no point being naturally good at mathematics, naturally able in mathematics. So the expansion of capabilities means that people are in a better position to exercise choices. They are better able to do things. So you're better able to do things, let's say, with an education, or if you're healthy, if you have access to healthcare. Um, so if we look at human development, economic development is not an end in itself. There should be a simultaneous expansion of choices in other dimensions: social, cultural, political, and economic. So it's really a philosophical or ethical approach to development. Development is defined as freedom for Amartya Sen and other human development economists. So the idea is development is this means economic development is a means to an end. And there is an assumption or realization amongst human development economists that, growth may not trickle down. So if we look at many economies throughout the world, we find that particularly with the transition to market forces, yes, societies such as India and China have become wealthier. However, it is those people within India and China who have access to social, cultural, political, and economic capital who have managed to do better as a result of the transition to market forces. Whereas those at the very bottom of the hierarchy, rural workers, migrant workers, um, within South Asia, women or people who are from lower caste backgrounds have not benefited from the expansion of market forces. So there is an understanding that it is necessary to make the market work for poorer people or more disadvantaged people. There is nothing naturally embedded within the market which will lead to growth trickling down to the poorest communities. So if we look at human development approaches, we see that there's been there's been an emphasis placed on the provision of microcredit. So microcredit, particularly in societies such as Bangladesh and other societies within South Asia and also sub-Saharan Africa, does not necessarily lead to an expansion of income. It does not affect gross domestic product. But what it does do is give the most disadvantaged sections of society within Bangladesh. I'm looking at Bangladesh because of the example of Grameen Bank with Muhammad Yunus, who won the Nobel Prize as a result of his pioneering work with the Grameen Bank. The idea was to provide credit to people who would not have access to a bank loan. So women from poorer backgrounds who would be given credit, and they would be able to create industries or to, let us say, weave, make products which could meet a particular demand. And this would enable them, they would see the range of choices which are available to them expand. So rather than just staying at home and sort of doing the cooking, looking after the kids, women were selling baskets. And even if the money which they got from selling baskets was minuscule in terms of gross domestic product per capita, it led to an expansion of choices, which the women, which were available for women. So women felt more I'm using women, but it wasn't necessary. It's not gendered here. It's also men from lower class backgrounds, felt more empowered. And this is a key word which we'll come back to when we look at the human development paradigm. The idea of empowerment, the idea of being capable of doing things which you were not capable of doing before, is an important part of the human development approach. So finally, there is evidence to show, and this is the point which I made earlier, that growth does not automatically trickle down. It is not automatic, and as I mentioned beforehand, we must look for ways of making the market work for the poorer sections of society, rather than believing that the market will automatically do so, which is the dominant view in economic development today. Okay, let's look at these two types of development in comparison. This table looks at the economic development approach and the human development approach. And we can see that they differ in their view of people, in their objective, in the indicator which they use to measure development, and overall in their approach or their ontology on what development is. So let's look at the economic development approach. People are seen as beneficiaries of development. And I think this is where I think in the next section we would look in greater detail at the different schools of thought within the economic development approach. So particularly from the 1940s right up to the 1970s, the assumption was that the state would play a key role in the economy by stimulating demand. And this is actually also the dominant approach within Japan today, particularly around the Abenomics, the economic policy, which was identified with the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, which sought to stimulate the economy by encouraging demand, by pumping money into the economy. So certainly the idea here under this form of economic policy, which I'm going to call Keynesian economics after John Maynard Keynes, the British economist who's credited for looking at the role of the state in stimulating demand. What we find is that people are beneficiaries of economic development. Under neoliberal economic system, people can be also seen as agents, but the idea of wealth trickling down means really that people benefit anyway. So if you have a Bill Gates or a Carlos Slim in your economy, then eventually this will benefit poorer sections of society. There's something which is automatic or inevitable within this process. This is very different from the human development approach, which regards human beings as agents of development. So development cannot be done for others. Development needs to be done for yourself. You need to take agency. So let us look at the example of isolated rural communities in Bangladesh, for example, or other parts of the world. They are agents of their own development, because through the provision of microcredit, they can create industries which serve which can supply certain demands or satisfy certain demands locally or internationally. So they're agents here of their own development. And they see, as we'll see later, with the objective, expansion of human choices and capabilities. So from the economic development approach, the objective is wealth creation. The idea of the expansion of the pie, a bigger pie. We think of the economy as a pie. If you create a bigger pie, then even if the slice is diminishing, your slice of the pie is diminishing, you still have more pie. That's the idea from the dominant approaches to economic development. The focus should be on wealth creation. The focus should be on encouraging economic growth. From the human development approach, the focus on economic growth can be beneficial if it leads to the expansion of human capabilities and choices. However, there is no point in having, let us say, a huge GDP per capita if you're in a society where a section of the population is unable, let's say, to go to have healthcare access or to have access to education. Or in some societies, you have the freedom, let us say, to shop, but not to be educated. So this does not lead to expansion of human capabilities and choices. So choices means having choices which are available to you. It's the exercise of that choice which leads to freedom. So development is seen as freedom. Now, if we look at the indicators of development, then we find that from the economic development approach, the main indicator still remains gross domestic product per capita. So we see in the world today that the United States is still the largest economy in the world. China is rapidly catching up, and Japan is the third largest economy in the world. However, even though China has a larger economy, Japan has a higher GDP per capita, meaning gross domestic product per person. So this is seen as the main indicator of economic growth. Now, if we look at human development approach, there is also a commitment to measuring development. Under the human development approach, development is measured through human development indicators. Now, you can find this in the United Nations Development Program, Human Development Reports, which are published every year. And you see that there is a whole section which looks at different indicators. So the idea is that GDP per capita is only one indicator for economic growth. There are other indicators for economic growth. Perhaps the most important is life expectancy, how long people are expected to live. Allied to this are ideas of infant mortality, access to education, other criteria which look at gender empowerment or the proportion of women in the labor force. So we find a variety of different indicators used to assess how developed a particular society is. So I think it is worthwhile pointing out at this stage, and I'll return to this perhaps if we have time when we look at the post-development approach, that the basic unit here is still seen as the nation state. So if we look at the World Bank takes an economic development approach. The World Bank indicators, we find that the basic units, which look at GDP per capita, are still nation states. If we look at human development indicators, then we find, again, the main units are nation states. However, the approaches are different. So the economic development approach is an economic approach. Wealth creation is the end of development. However, the approach taken by human development is a more ethical approach. The idea is that the creation of wealth is not an end in itself, but it only leads to development if it leads to an expansion of human capabilities and choices. So capabilities means if you're able to do more things than you were able to do before. And if you see the different choices which are available to you, and you're able to exercise those choices to make decisions on your own behalf, this is the objective of development. The exercise of choice is freedom. Okay, let me very briefly look at development as modernization. So as I mentioned earlier in the lecture, development comes from modernization theory. Modernization theory was the main paradigm for the study of society during the 20th century. And in fact, it's a dominant theory within the social sciences, and particularly within sociology. So quite simply, modernization can be defined as the transition of traditional into modern societies. Now, initially within sociology, this idea of the transition from the traditional to the modern was seen internally within a particular society. So an inevitable consequence of modernization meant that people left small isolated rural communities and went to live in big cities. They went to live in big cities because they could find jobs, and this created a more modern society. There were different ways, different mechanisms which were necessary in order to create order or to maintain order between cities composed of strangers where you didn't know everybody, as opposed to a traditional village where you knew everybody and you knew how to behave. So this is where we have the idea of the law, the rule of law, where you have the development of modern state structures. So initially, modernization looked at this as a modernization theory, looked at the transition of the traditional and modern within societies. So this is internal. However, what development does is it sort of spatializes it. By spatializes it, I mean that it takes a whole part of the world and defines them in terms of their level of development. Their level of development is defined by criteria of modernity, how modern they are. Whereas beforehand we talked in terms of traditional villages, traditional societies, with decolonization in the 1950s and 1960s, you had the emergence of newly independent societies, newly independent nation states, which were seen as developing countries. They were catching up with those modern societies. So getting back to my idea of spatialization, by spatialization, I mean, rather than looking at a traditional village and saying, well, that village may be an example of a traditional mode of existence. If we look at what modernization theory did when it, or look at the origins of development in modernization theory, it basically said that these traditional societies were seen as developing countries and they should catch up with more modern societies. So modern societies were seen as developed countries. So this idea of development as modernization was very prevalent within the Cold War period because you had two different modes of modernity, two different ways of looking at a modern society. So you had, of course, within the United States, you had different ideas of stages in development and the creation of a liberal democratic structures and a capitalist or free market economy was seen as the hallmark of a developed society. You also had, right until 1990, the Soviet model. And if we look at the Soviet model, the idea was that socialism was more modern than capitalism, was more modern than the liberal democratic approach taken, in theory at least, by Western societies. So the idea was that inevitably with modernization, you had a transition to a socialist society. Now, the key agent of development, when we look at both of these approaches to modernity, the Western approach to modernity, liberal capitalism and the market, and the Soviet socialist idea of modernity, which looks at the creation of a more equal society based on common ownership of the means of production. The state is seen as the agent of development. By agent of development, it is the state which pursues policies which are designed to modernize a particular society. So in the case of a society such as Japan, for example, the state has played a key role in stimulating the economy after the post-war period by organizing production, stimulating demand, making loans available for bigger Japanese companies, creating protection barriers, which have allowed Japanese companies to be protected from international competition in order to consolidate its share of the domestic market. So the idea here is that the state is seen as an agent of development. Okay. Now, let us look at, again, very briefly, at the different theories of economic development which have arisen from modernization theory. So let's look at modernization theory as a holistic theory. By holistic, I mean it's a theory about everything. It's a theory about society. It's a theory about life. There's inevitability of transformation from the traditional to the modern. So the different criteria of modernity. But if we look at modern societies, they're characterized by today, definitely we have modern societies are characterized by the existence of market economies. You have strong states which are capable of maintaining law and order. You have education systems. You have urban populations and urban economies. For the first time, I think, in human history, the majority of people live in cities rather than agrarian or agricultural communities. So modernization theory can be seen as this holistic theory of a transformation of society itself. In economics, there are different ways to achieve modernity, and that's what these different schools of thought or these different approaches to economic development attempt to do. So the dominant understanding, I think, still today would be seen as neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is seen as neoclassical economics. The hallmark of neoclassical economics is a belief in laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire just means leave it be. So in other words, it here is the market. So a preference for market forces, small state, fiscal responsibility. The state does not need to stimulate demand, because if it stimulates demand, this may lead to inflation. The dominant theory in the post-war world from the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions in 1944. The Bretton Woods institutions are the International Monetary Fund, the International Bank for Reconstruction Development, which is now seen as the World Bank. And today we have the World Trade Organization, but that was only set up during the 1990s. But the dominant theory within the post-war world was embedded liberalism. Embedded liberalism, the idea of embedded means that the state is embedded in the economy, and the state has to play a key role in stimulating demand and in organizing economic productivity. So the idea is that if you let the market to its own devices under laissez-faire economics, there are cycles of boom and bust. So financial crises are endemic within the economic system. They can be managed, however, by state intervention in the economy. So economically speaking, the key theorist identified with embedded liberalism is, of course, John Maynard Keynes. So Keynes argued that the state can play a key role in stimulating demand in the economy. So Keynesian approaches to the economy are still prevalent today in societies such as Japan, and to a lesser extent in other societies throughout the world. Even you could make the case for saying that there are certainly some Keynesian elements to the Chinese economy. However, China as a socialist society claims to be following a Marxist path to modernity and to modernization. And I think it's very important for us here to mention Marxism. Because of time, I cannot go through Marxism in great depth. But the point I'd like to make is that Marxism is a theory of modernity. Marx himself came up with the theory of historical materialism. By historical materialism, he argued that human history can be divided into stages of development, each of which were characterized by a dominant mode of production. Mode of production would be a way of organizing economic activity. So he made a distinction looking at Western Europe, but this could also be applicable to Japan, between a feudal society. A feudal society was characterized by people working on the land. So the land was not owned by the people who worked on it. It was owned by feudal landlords, by daimyo within the Japanese case. And each of these daimyo would have their own army. This is where you have the idea of the samurai within Japan. But within Western Europe, then you had a decentralization of political power, competing power sources, private armies. It's only with the transformation of the economy and the transition to capitalism. So Marx gave us our definition of capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system which is based on production for profit. So wherever you have production for profit, you have a capitalist economy. Now, the idea is that this profit is not consumed. It is not used for, let's say, as in the feudal economies, which were characterized by mercantilist policies. Mercantilism may be seen as a way in which states would use economic wealth and development to fund territorial expansion or to fund colonization. So under capitalism, the idea is that this profit is reinvested in the economy. And this reinvestment of capital in the economy stimulates economic growth naturally. And this leads to development. However, the importance of Marxism and the importance of Marx is his understanding of capitalism as an inherently exploitative process. We don't need to get into Marxist economics in the remaining time or in this course, but he attempted to show how, if we look at the different relations of production within a capitalist society, society is characterized by the private ownership of the means of production. So people who own the means of production can be seen as part of the dominant capitalist class. He used the term bourgeoisie, but in this sense, it's a capitalist class. And the other productive class, or the most productive class, were workers. Now, the idea is that the workers do things, the proletariat, as he claimed, as he called them. The workers do things, they produce things, but they're paid by capitalists. Capitalists own privately the means of production. So Marx showed how capitalism contained within it a series of contradictions. Now, the main contradiction here was that the people who are doing the job, the workers, are basically subsidizing the salaries of the capitalists. The capitalists, for Marx, did not engage within productive activity. They weren't workers. They did not make things. So Marx put forward the idea of a common ownership of the means of production. So once you get rid of the capitalists, not getting rid of the capitalists as people, but once you expropriate the means of production and you have common ownership of the means of production, this would lead to a more equal society, an equal society which will have fewer contradictions. Now, I would like now to look at how Marxism stimulated the growth of a different school of thought, which is going to be seen as the underdevelopment theory. So Marxism can be seen as a theory of development, but Marxism can also be seen as a theory of underdevelopment. So Marxism stimulated ideas of structuralism, dependency theory, and world systems theory. I will very briefly go through all of them, and we'll have more time to discuss this later during the Q&A session. But if we look at the main theories of development, we can make a distinction between main theories of underdevelopment, then we can make a distinction between economic theories, which are these economic theories are represented by structuralism, the ideas of declining terms of trade, which was put forward by an Argentinian economist, Raul Prebisch, during the 1950s when he was a member of the Economic Commission of Latin America. Prebisch argued, and using Argentina as a case study, but most of the southern cone of the Americas, that the terms of trade were declining for societies which relied on the export of raw materials and products. So the idea is if you export raw materials, beef, for example, in Argentina's case, and you import manufactured goods, these manufactured goods cost more than raw materials. So over a long period of time, this would lead to a secular decline in the terms of trade, which means that societies which depend upon the export of primary commodities will become poorer, and those societies which will be able to export manufactured products would become richer. Dependency theory is less an economic theory and more political theory. As posited by Ander Günther Frank, the argument is that capitalism leads to underdevelopment. Now, please note that Marx believed that capitalism led to development, but it was an uneven form of development. So the capitalist class benefited more than the working class, but the working class also developed as a result of capitalism. Their income expanded. What Frank said was that what capitalism does is underdevelop whole societies. It makes people poorer. And not only does it make people poorer, but it makes whole regions poorer by exploiting their natural resources. So he looks at structuralism, he looks at terms of trade and says, well, you know, what can explain the fact that developing societies continue to export raw materials and do not export manufactured goods? And his answer to this question was that in most developing societies or newly colonized societies, these were ruled by a class, a particular class of people, a comprador class, who ruled a particular society with the interests of northern capital, with the interests of the capitalist class in mind, and with the interests of an international capitalist class. So the roots here of capitalism lie within imperialism. And very briefly, if I could introduce before stopping, world systems theory. World systems theory is a form of dependency theory which believed that capitalism does lead to underdevelopment. However, the idea was that capitalism constituted a world system. And whereas Frank believed that some societies could break away from capitalism through a socialist revolution. So he looked at Chile under Salvador Allende before the coup of September 11th in the 1970s and 1972 as a society which could have moved towards a democratic socialist path, but was not allowed to by a capitalist elite, which was collaborating with the United States. For Immanuel Wallerstein, there was no escape from capitalism. There was no escape from capitalism because we live within a world capitalist system. However, there is room for development in the semi-periphery. The semi-periphery were those societies which were not formally colonized. So in other words, Japan and arguably China. Development can happen in those societies because they were not formally colonized. But if we look at most of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, these were societies which were colonized, and as a result of colonization, the main resources are not in the hands of the state. The main resources in the economic system are in the hands of companies which have their origins within the colonial era. Okay, I will stop here and I may go through this table again in a separate mini lecture and also focus on post-development thinking. Okay, I hope you found this useful. Thank you very much.